Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New Work in Queer and Trans Studies, Latinx Studies. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Mark Rifkin. I'm the Linda Arnold Carlisle Distinguished Excellence Professor in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Professor of English at UNC Greensboro. Again, if everyone could keep their mics off and their cameras off and pin the view to the speaker, that would be great. Also, it'd be wonderful if folks could refrain from using the everyone chat until we get to question and answer, and then folks can, the Q&A portion, and then folks can pose questions there, or you'll be able to raise your hand, and then if you want to actually voice your question, that would be great. Also, reminder, the session is being recorded. I'd like to note that where I am now in Durham, North Carolina, is on the lands of Occaneechi, Tuscarora, and Saponi peoples. UNCG is on the lands of Kiawe and Sora peoples, as well as other Saponi peoples. This presentation is part of the Linda Arnold Carlisle Professorship. So I'd like to thank Linda Carlisle and the Friends of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at UNCG. I'd also like to thank WGSS and the English department for sponsoring the event. A little bit of background on WGSS at UNCG. It was founded in 1972, and it's one of the oldest such programs in the country. And we have 3 degree programs: a bachelor's, a master's, and a graduate certificate. I'd also like to thank Lisa Levenstein, who is the director of the WGSS program, and Kelly Taylor, who's the program administrator, for all of their help in putting things together today. Today's presentation is the 3rd in a 4-part series, and the final panel focused on Asian American studies will be on March 31st. So now let me introduce our speakers. First is Dr. Carolina E. Alonso, who is an associate professor of Borders and Languages and Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as the chair of the sociology department at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. She specializes in Chicanx literature and teaching Spanish to second language learners and heritage students. Dr. Alonso has published about Chicanx literature, pedagogies, and digital humanities in the US-Mexico border. She is currently writing a book about feminism and sorority in the Mexican Women's Soccer League. Our second speaker will be Dr. Omi Salas-SantaCruz, who is currently a President's Postdoctoral Fellow at Penn State University in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. They earned their PhD in education with a designated emphasis in critical theory and gender, women, and sexuality from the University of California, Berkeley. Their intellectual and community work engages decolonial and Latinx trans feminisms with a focus on trans and queer of color space making and resistance practices. Their current project examines questions at the intersections of race, land, Latinidad, practices of being, and the epistemologies of trans inclusion. First, Dr. Alonso will present, then for about 20 to 25 minutes, then Dr. Salas-SantaCruz, and then we will open things up for Q&A. So I'll turn things over to Dr. Alonso.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can all see that. Is that working? Okay, great. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here, those of you that are present on Zoom on a Friday afternoon. My presentation is called The Coming of Age Experience in Chicanx Queer Novels. And so I'll be specifically talking about 2 novels, but I'll give you a context about other literature as well. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that FLC, where I am right now, is situated upon the ancestral land and territory of the Nuchu Ute people, who were forcibly removed by the US government. I also acknowledge that this land is connected to the communal and ceremonial spaces of the Jicarilla, Abache, Apache, Pueblos of New Mexico, Hopi Sinom, Hopi, and Diné Navajo nations. It is important to acknowledge this setting because the narratives of the lands in this region have long been told from dominant perspectives without full recognition of the original land stewards who continue to inhabit and connect with this land. Thank you so much. me. There it is. I couldn't see anybody. All right, so I'll start just with some background. Chicanx youth are constantly exposed to racist, homophobic discourses from the most hierarchical sectors within the U.S. government. As you know, everything that is happening in Florida and Texas and other places that are targeting queer youth, but at the same time, Latinx youth, or in this case, my example with Mexican American youth, Mexican Chicano youth, Chicanx, they're being targeted with racist comments, like former President Donald Trump saying that Mexicans are drug dealers or criminals or rapists, and some are good people, right? And so um, I believe that now more than ever we should have validation and representation of queer youth in literature as well as in any other source of media and so on and so forth. But it is crucial for young people, Chicanx, queer people, to see themselves represented in authentic and positive ways. And so before I start about talking about these two novels, I wanted to just give you, I know some of you might be familiar with this, but the role of literature within Chicanx literature and culture has always been very important. In the 1960s, during the Chicano movement, literature was used by intellectuals, activists to reach the people, promote a Chicano identity. And I say Chicano because it was pretty much male identity, and to promote the vision of the movement. And so we have, for example, El Teatro Campesino, which was used with its acts to talk about issues that were important for the community, and also poetry like I Am Joaquin, which talked about what it was to be Chicano and this identity and all the complexities around it. And so I just wanted to mention that literature has always been important for the Chicanx people, Chicanx culture. And stories of coming of age are obviously not new in our literature, but it's also been a tradition within Chicanx authors since they started being published in the mainstream. And so in this sense, coming of age genre has been used as an artifact to establish a national identity in individuals who share specific characteristics and who coexist in the same community. And so some of you might know two of the fundamental or canonical works in Chicanx literature are actually coming of age novels. And the first, Y no se lo tragó la tierra by Tomás Rivera, which was published in 1971, and Bless Mi Última by Rudolfo Anaya, published in 1972. These were pretty much the two books that we consider canonic, the ones that enter the mainstream of Chicanx literature. And although they're very important for our literature, they are very much focused on male identity and heteronormative society or community, right? Years later, about 10 years later, Sandra Cisnero published The House of Mango Street, which is probably one of the most famous Latinx, Chicanx books. And it also gives us a coming of age story. And now it's a female, the protagonist is a female, Esperanza. And a lot of academics have pointed out how we can actually see queer aspects in the friendship relationships that, or relationship that Esperanza has with one of her friends, Sally. And with her machete in her hand, reading Chicana Lesbian, Catriona Rueda Esquivel analyzes girlhood, friendship, and comadrazgo. And she states that in the Chicana context, and I quote, girlhood is a space and time before the imposition of normative heterosexuality, and as such, provides a site for text to stage lesbian desires, end of quote. And so this topic of friendship is going to be important when I talk about the two novels that I focus on, because it is through these friendships that are socially perceived as inoffensive and innocent, that they provide a space for, in one case, lesbian desire, but in queer desire in general. I also wanted to talk about this book very briefly, because it doesn't get the recognition that it should have, as I believe, because it's the first Latinx YA, queer Latinx YA novel, Tommy Stands Alone, and it was published in 1995 by Arte Público Press in Houston, Texas. And Arte Público Press was also the first publisher that published The House on Mango Street. Tommy Stands Alone was published in 2013, and it's a continuation of that book. These books are installments in Velázquez's Roosevelt High School series. So there's a series of books, and two of them are about this topic. Is Tommy coming out, and then in the second book, he's trying to help other queer folks in his school. So it's very important, this book, I believe. And then here, I'll spend the rest of the time talking about these two books, What Night Brings, published in 2003 by Carla Trujillo, and Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. It's a long title, and it was published in 2012. So both books are very important in establishing different identities of what it is to be a Chicanx. Both of the books are written, take place in decades before their actual publication, which is very interesting, because it seems that the authors are trying to insert these stories in periods of times where we didn't have these representations. So What Night Brings, it's set on the 60s, and Aristotle and Dante is set on the 80s. And so What Night Brings tells the story of Marcy, who's an 11-year-old girl, and her sister, Corinne, and both of them are suffer from the violence of their parent, of their father, I'm sorry, and the indifference of their mother. So they have to struggle with this physical and psychological violence throughout the story. Marcy, the protagonist, prays to God every day, and she wishes for two things. For one thing is for her father to disappear, because he's obviously very violent to her, and the other thing that she wants to become a boy. She constantly talks about having a penis so that she can be with other women and other girls. So she thinks that being a boy is the only way that she can actually date other girls. And so this book actually received recognition within the LGBTQI literary community. It was a finalist for the Lambda Book Award. And and it also received a Marmol Prize and Latino Literary Foundation Book Award. So we see that it's been recognized within the Latinx literature and LGBTQI plus literature. Aristotle and Dante introduces us to Ari, who's the protagonist, and he's a very introvert boy who lives in El Paso in the 80s, and he meets Dante, who is completely the opposite of him, and they become best friends. And this book has been very, very popular. It won, as you can see in all the seals that it has on the screen, it won the Lambda Literary Award and the Stonewall Book Award, as well as the Pura Belpre Award, which, I quote, is presented annually to a Latina writer and illustrator whose work best portrays, affirms, and celebrates the Latino cultural experience in an outstanding work of literature for children and youth, end of quote. And I thought that was very important to mention, because it does state how this book celebrates the Latino cultural experience with a queer character as Ari and Dante. This book, as I mentioned, has been very successful. In 2015, Editorial Planeta published the Spanish version, which, it's a topic for a bigger conversation about how hard it is for Chicanx books to get recognition in Mexico, for example. This has been very popular there too. Its audiobook is narrated by multi-awarded Puerto Rican figure Lin-Manuel Miranda. there's a movie, actually, I think it came out last year, but it hasn't been, it's on in festivals and whatnot, but it's supposed to come out in movie theaters or streaming this year. And there's the sequel, Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World, which was published in 2021. And I do want to mention that one of the things that Aristotle and Dante lacks, if you know, for couldn't find a better word, but is the discussion of the AIDS pandemic, since it's set in the 80s, right? But in the new book, in the sequel, they do talk about it a lot more, so they kind of correct that. So yeah, sorry if I'm going really fast. I want to speak in English as I speak in Spanish. But yeah, so I was talking about friendships and queer desires, and so in both of these novels, these books, the main characters experience queer desires in spaces that are generally considered by heteropatriarchal society as normative, and friendships, right? These spaces don't represent really a social threat, and so, but these moments of friendships are really decisive for the characters' constructions and the development of their subjectivity. In What Night Brings, Marcy has a friendship with a neighbor who's older than she is, Raquel, and it's because of these interactions that she starts, thinking about being with other girls, and having this romantic interest for other girls. And I'll quote, when she's with Raquel, she says, each time she put something in my arms, I wanted to grab and kiss her just like the people on TV. But all I could do was look at her and smile like an idiot. I let Raquel's house happy, and I felt good because I got to be with her. End of quote. And so, which is what is interesting about this too, is that after this scene happens, Marcy goes to her mom and tells her, I was with Raquel, the neighbor, and the mom's just like, she literally just says, okay, right? So she ignores this relationship. She doesn't really think anything of it. And so, as Esquivel has pointed out, the expectation that female friendships are innocent without a sexual component prevents Delia, who's the mom, from considering that her daughter could desire in some way Raquel. And the same thing happens in Aristotle and Dante. Is because of this friendship that Ari starts, experiencing queer desires. And although the social rules and expectations are different for male and female adolescents in terms of sexuality, because while girls are seen as passive and almost asexual, boys, at least in the general context, Latinx context, are usually assigned and even promoted an active sexual role. However, this sexual role is heterosexual. So in this case, the Esquivel's theories are still significant, even though they're male to male friendships, right? Male to male friendships in the Chicanx culture do not really represent a risk for the heteropatriarchal hegemony. One of the examples of this queer desire in the novel is when Ari had an accident, and Dante is giving him a sponge bath, and I quote, I felt Dante's hand on my shoulders, the warm water, the soap, the washed clothes. He made me feel fragile as porcelain. End of quote. However, instead of acknowledging this desire, Ari's constantly policing himself, feeling rage instead of trying to understand his feelings. And as Esquivel points out, in this type of relationships, I quote, behaviors, identities, and desires are mediated by the heteronormativity of the worlds in which they live, the characters. Love and desire are constituted in relation to heterosexuality. And so throughout the novel, Ari is constantly in denial, and he even states, I don't kiss boys, and he's struggling with these feelings. The two images that I have here are from online forums. These two characters are very famous in internet, right? In their friendship and their love. So silences and secrets. Well, Aristotle and Dante even has the title of secrets, right? But both of the novels have these silences that are the characters are trying to uncover the secrets, that they're trying to figure out what they mean, and most of them have to do with sexuality, right? Either their own or family, like a queer uncle, a lesbian aunt, and there's a lot of silencing too. And so when Marcy's, by the way, 11 years old, I forgot to mention that, she's trying to question a lot of things, and she in two of the most important spaces for Chicanx community in general, which is the church and the family. And so when she's in her catechism, she's constantly reprimanded by the nuns and the mother superior, and they even ask her not to ever ask questions again. And when she goes home, she wants to continue asking questions, and her mom is always silencing her. Her mom portrays this like the gatekeepers of patriarchy, in this case, reproducing patriarchy in her home. And so like, for example, one time Marcy asked the nuns who were they married to, because they always talked about that. And so Delia, her mom, censors her, and she says, my mom told me her husband was Jesus, and that I shouldn't have asked her that because it wasn't nice. But then she questions, well, how can the nuns have, all of them share one husband? And her mother replies, ay, Marcia malcriada, you and your nasty questions. End of quote. And the adjective that she chooses to silence and reprimand Marcy are significant: malcriada and nasty. And so her curiosity is depicted as something disgusting, as something that makes her a malcriada, a naughty girl, one lacking a good education, pretty much. And so the way that Delia uses to silence her daughter is she uses language as a weapon, right? And in Borderlands, La Frontera, the new mestiza, Gloria Ansaldúa talks about how these measures used by society to silence women. And so in How to Tame a Wild Tongue, she specifically mentions how when a woman questions the rules of her community, she's labeled in different ways than men. And I quote, I remember one of the sins I'd recite to the priest in the confession box, the few times I went to confession. Talking back to my mother, hablar para atrás, repelar, hocicona, repelona, chismosa, having a big mouth, questioning, carrying tales tales are all signs of being malcriada. Again, the word malcriada is associated with the silencing process used in patriarchal systems. On the other hand, Ari, he doesn't fit in his community, in the school, and with friends around him, because he's very introvert. But he's also trying to constantly unravel what happened with his brother, who is in prison, but his family doesn't talk about it, right? He also doesn't know or finds out about her aunt being a lesbian, and how in the whole process of why they hid that from him. And his brother is actually in prison because he well, I'll talk about a little bit about that in a little bit. And so both of these characters are surrounded by violence, and both of them internalize it into the degree of wanting to reproduce it, or at least doing it, or wishing that they could reproduce it. In What Night Brings, Eddie is the father, constantly beats Marcy and her sister, and he does it with the wife as well. And so Marcy wants to become a boy because she wants to be with other girls, but also she wants to feel more powerful and be able to confront her dad. And on the other hand, Addie actually does engage in physical fights with other guys. And for example, he tries to avenge Dante, who had been bitten because he was kissing another guy. And so he, like it says here, everything was a blur, and I just kept going at him, and he goes crazy, as he says, trying to avenge him, right? So all of these acts of violence, in Adi's case, it's what makes his parents talk to him and tell him, you know, you need to stop running away from your feelings, and there's so much repression that you have, a lot of internalized homophobia. And the brother now, his brother was incarcerated because he killed a sex worker. And in the story, they say that the brother found out that the sex worker was travestite, and so he kills her and then kills another man in prison. And that's another thing. This book doesn't really go in depth into the transphobia. On the second book, they do talk more about that, and how the brother is in prison because of that. To to come out, I'm almost done. Both protagonists have to leave the spaces that surround them. Marcy leaves to New Mexico with her grandmother, who is able to rescue her from all that violence. And Adi usually goes to the desert so that he can feel away, like he doesn't feel the pressure of El Paso and the community judging him because of his queerness. And kind of like El Paso works as a panopticon, the way that Michel Foucault has expressed it, which is always policing him, right? Both of them find these spaces of freedom. In fact, Marcy, when she goes to New Mexico, finds another friend, Robbie. She tells her, I like girls. Robbie says, I like girls too. And then Robbie asks, do you think that's a sin? And Marcy says no, and they kissed with a, you know, happy ending. And in the desert is where Adi feels more comfortable, and he confesses his love for Dante, and that's where they kiss for the first time. And so just wanted to mention the importance of this text having happy endings. I mean, with, you know, the way that the violence surrounding queer youth, the bullying in school, violence, family rejection, suicide rate, positive representation in literature is not just entertainment, it is a vital source of support and empowerment. And of course, we need more than, you know, books and happy endings, laws and regulations, but this is something important too. And I'll end with the two books that I talked about. Is a story about cisgender youth, and so there are obviously other queer identities in Latinx literature, and there are more stories coming out with non-binary teens, trans characters, queer girls. And one of the examples that I wanted to briefly mention was Cemetery Boys, which was published in 2020, and it's about a trans boy, Jadriel, who wants to become a brujo, and he does talk about important themes like transphobia, misgendering, Latinidad, deportation. It's a very good representation. And lastly, all of these books that you see here came out last year, so I'm very hopeful for the new, you know, representations of queer youth, queer Latinx youth. Like Lake Lore is a story about two non-binary teens. So everything indicates that we're having more and more representations for queer Latinx youth. And I'll stop there. Sorry if I went too fast, and if there's something that you didn't understand, just please let me know.
Thank you very much. And now turn things over to Dr. Salas-SantaCruz.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. I'm just going to share a piece that I've been working on. and it's still, I'm still thinking with it. I was sharing with Mark that when I got the invitation on this like concept of newness, um, I I'm in the philosophical camp that is like I don't think I'm presenting anything new. I'm doing new applicability to existing decolonial and women of color feminist theories, especially when it comes to transness and translatinidad. So I'm gonna just read from this piece that I've been working on that emerged from teaching the first Trans Latinx studies at Stanford during the winter of 2020. And this just emerged as a result from the experiences of that class. So far the title is like non-binary as epistemic refusal of colonial and race amnesiac academic practices around translatinidad. Okay, nonsense. In the winter of 2020, I was teaching Trans Latinx studies. During the first 2 weeks of class, students began to voice their discontent on how the initial readings were mostly about gay Latinos or Joteria scholarship. An indigenous trans non-binary student voiced their concern. Quote, I am disappointed with the readings. I took a general intro to trans studies, and at least they had 1 week for Latinx trans scholarship. It doesn't make sense to have a course title, Trans Latinx Studies, if we only read Joteria or queer Latino history. I asked them to keep reading and to write down their thoughts. After all, I'm a pedagogue. I knew the student was in fact engaging with the ideological common sense of trans studies. So yes, my reading choices for them did not make sense, not at least for the concept of trans as they know it. By the 4th week, the same student left the following message on Canvas. I was looking for trans, not recognizing that such imposition is another method to erase us. It is nonsense to think we're not there. End of quote. This there is the archive. The student was learning to recognize each other in the face of such erasure. The student was learning to stop looking for trans in the archive as we currently know it or learn about it. The student began to understand what Gloria Anzaldúa and Jackie Alexander asks us to do, which is to listen and remember each other over and over again. What the student was starting to understand is the discursive violence of what counts as trans phenomena, from theory to identity, personhood, and materiality, and how they, as students, had learned the discursive contours of what counts as trans in schools and university programs. I'm interested in thinking with the nonsense as not the sense of common sense in trans theory, the senses that are discarded, manipulated, and forgotten, but dwell in the nonsense. And the nonsense to think that the nonsense is an absence and not a possibility, in Anzaldúa's words, una entrada. What I was teaching my students was to read, think, and sense through a decolonial method that accounts for the relations of power that structure the common sense, the good sense, and the nonsense of trans theory, that denies my students to approach senses differently, where looking for trans is not seen, as we need other senses to grasp the social relations that exist and emerge within the dynamic resistance to gender coloniality. I was teaching new senses beyond looking and visibility as to how to approach a long history of trans of color archives and histories of genderqueer embodiments, practices, and resistant materialities among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color populations in the US and Latin America, or more precisely, Abayala. I was teaching a non-binary way of thinking within coloniality, as to think within the nonsense of trans scholarship, a pedagogical process of non-binary thinking within epistemic imperialism that I had to learn from decolonial feminist thought, a pedagogy of crossings, of shifting, and trespassings as epistemic refusals to dualism and universalism that prevents us from grappling with complex histories, desires, knowledges, identities, beings, and becomings. I was teaching my students this non-binary modality of consciousness as to think within complex borderlands and not within the common sense of concepts. Moreover, I was using the method of remembering that grounds the contributions of women of color feminisms as to confront ideological and discursive, intentional and unintentional violence within trans studies. I was teaching them that to remember is a trans of color methodology, where we study ideology, both in the Gramscian either or of common sense and good sense and nonsense within, the worlds of sense denied through narrow conceptions of thinking trans/gender. A non-binary approach to nonsense is to refuse the numerous academic practices around trans phenomena that continuously make Black, brown, and indigenous trans feminisms and social practices as, quote, the belated arrival to the white trans archive, even when discussing the pedagogies of decolonizing transgender studies. This non-binary approach to sense is a grappling with the nonsense of the discursive walls of trans phenomena and how my students' new consciousness emerge. The consciousness, or la facultad, of living in a way that is reactionary, right? Like, we're not there, to whiteness, and it's lived half and half, mitad and mitad, as Ansaldúa reminds us, as queer, non-binary, trans, BIPOC people are made to navigate the cultural and dominant ideologies while simultaneously being placed in zones of non-being and non-existence, all while our language, histories, and ways of living are constantly looted and silenced. What I was teaching my students was how to shift as a pedagogical practice away from binary thinking, a pedagogical refusal that I had learned from being and thinking within a multiplicity of borderlands and from Black, brown, indigenous solidarity, a pedagogical coalitional practice to rethink how we think through what trans knowledge consists of, how we come to know trans bodies, people, and histories, and the knowledge we value as trans archives and histories that directly confront what Barbara Christian calls the race for theory, particularly trans theory that devalues our forms of theorizing trans embodiments and relationality among formerly colonized people and those that continue to live, resist, heal, and thrive within settler coloniality. Moreover, I was using a non-binary epistemic approach to critique what Di Pietro calls the benevolent trans violence, the monocultural and condescending ignorance about trans of color life, theory, and history, and to think from the in-between and betwixt trans Latinx feminist theory, indigenous and two-spirit trans critique, and Black trans theory as to decolonize how we think through trans phenomena in academic practices. This shift I learned from the coalition of US women of color feminists that moves from studying, researching the either or inside out queer/trans/gender, trans, cis, oppression resistant binaries, production, reproduction, human and human, to thinking with the interrelated and mutual intersecability of these categories, not simply as new orientations to trans phenomena, but as a non-binary modality of thinking that shifts the ground from where we begin to think within coloniality. This call to shift in the Ansalduan sense is to remember a pedagogy and method that moves us away from the ongoing discursive production of trans as a European and Anglo theory and practice, but also as a political commitment to historicize the centrality of non-binary thinking with and within Black, indigenous, decolonial, and women of color feminism. It is a necessary pedagogical praxis that allows us to listen, not at rediscovering, but approaching with new senses what has been there all along. As we listen to trans methodologies, its crossings, shiftings, and trespassings, we begin to sense the complex history of BIPOC trans scholarship grounded in these forms of Black feminist thought, borderland thinking, decolonial feminism, indigenous two-spirit theory, and knowledge as precursors to knowledge on permeable bodies, history, and subjective practices in response to living and thinking within coloniality and modernity. This context fragments ourselves and relations into assumed disparate disaggregate categories, right? The binary between trans, cis, and all that. So I'm going to skip a paragraph here because I want to keep reading. So from that moment, rather than looking for trans phenomena, my students began to account for coloniality, settler colonialism, and anti-Blackness, not only in how we understand trans phenomena, but how it shapes subaltern trans of color sociality and relationality. And this is not to argue against white trans theory or knowledge of white Euro and Anglo trans life, but to account for how trans BIPOC populations, their experiences, knowledge, and imaginations fit into a broader discussion of trans justice and the ongoing colonial complicity embedded within trans knowledge production. The coloniality that structures both trans legibility in the US and abroad, and the atmospheres of trans violence and antagonism within the academic industrial complex. Sorry. When we're limited by an orientation of trans phenomena that does not account or makes to count the soundscapes that emerge in resistance to gender coloniality and the geopolitics of knowledge production. These soundscapes of trans embodiments, life, and relationality have a long history of theorizing in diasporic philosophy as a subjectless criticism where knowledge is to be found in the flesh and how people move within complex and intermeshed subjectivities in their ontological and existential pluralism. In this course, non-binary thinking of trans-Latinidad provides a critical engagement with trans of color subjects, relations, and histories in their co-constituted multiplicities of relation of power and context. So understanding, critiquing, and transforming different relations of power is a central imperative for decolonial work. As a function of remembering, I repeat, this form of epistemic refusal as a non-binary thinking within is not new. Binary thinking and its discursive violence places us in a constant ideological war between hegemony and counter-hegemony as to arrive to a common sense. Women and queer of color scholars within the US have questioned whether queer or trans studies and politics, among other canons, could give language to a more precise ways of thinking about race, gender, and sexuality in terms of relations to power. In a roundtable discussion, Baqueta and others, for example, highlight how white queer theory, and by extension, white trans theory, is characterized by what she described as colonial and race amnesia. Baqueta explains that a principal component to white queer theory is the choice to forget and overlook, quote, colonialism, racism, Islamophobia, capitalism, class relations, and other relations of power, thereby, end of quote, thereby reproducing these isms inside the theory itself. Such settler colonial common sense requires then for us to take a decolonial approach to the trans imaginary and center the act of remembering and historicizing Black, Latina, and Indigenous theorizings on bodies, practices, and responses to discursive violence under what Mohanty describes Western eyes. And then I'm gonna go further down. For example, Tinsley reminds us that if we look for queer and trans Caribbean people in the archive, we might find nothing, mostly because the vocabulary of trans and queer theory and its universalism cannot let us see the prisms in which Caribbean authors have projected their vision of creative genders and sexualities. Similarly, Maria Lugones reminds us that looking for is a practice and discourse of colonization, a colonial methodology that prevents us from seeing coloniality and the complex resistance within. Looking for transgender, as my students began to do, was premised on gender as being a meta category that exists everywhere, and thus we can find transgender comparisons across societies. Under this premise, we can at least find similarities in what gender is for different people, one would assume. And as we continue to look for, we actually miss the actual relations, the experiences, and cultural understandings of embodiments, of being, and sociality as resistant embodiment and practices that go beyond the matter of individuality and the self, and gender as an assumed universal category. Moreover, in looking for transgender, we contribute to the colonial race amnesia that can further colonize our lives and the meaning of our words. Non-binary thinking is thus a necessary epistemic shift for subaltern people that resist the ongoing structures to colonize the meaning and purpose of our lives. This shift then is necessary as to learn from within and alongside subjugated trends of color knowledge, theory, and strategies, and ways of living and existing that are geographically, historically, and culturally grounded in specific worldviews, and as a necessary political maneuvers to avoid discursive colonization. To be clear, shifts are not reorientations, as this has led to intersectional approaches from which identity or social group we collect our data or learn about trends, usually deployed as standpoint or situated epistemology aimed at understanding trans of color experiences. Instead, this shift unroots trans phenomena. Specifically, this ungrounding commits to the conditions of what Morgenson describes the conditions of trans critique that account for colonial and racial violence within settler colonialism, a quote, thinking within complexities as a non-binary way of meaning making within coloniality, or what Baqueta calls the co-formations and co-productions of power, essential to decolonial politics across all subjects, beings, becomings. Shifting then is a pedagogy of non-binary thinking, is not simply a new horizon or orientation. Orientations have remained grounded as they turn to alternative horizons, mostly caught in the binary logic where horizons seldomly overlap. Shifts are tectonic. They're caught in multiple disparate movements and collisions. They trespass common sense, they trespass the good sense and the nonsense. I imagine shifts occurring in what Maria Lugones describes as the movement within the oppressing / being oppressed, resisting relation, within those experiencing simultaneously fragmentation and multiplicity. Shifts moves us from the ground that we're settled in, such as the simple binary logic of oppression resistance. This non-binary thinking and complex thinking that refuses to look for trans phenomena opens the space for seeing, sensing coloniality, and to understand the genealogies, histories, and conceptualizations of complex identities and embodiments. Once we account for coloniality in trans method and pedagogical practices, then we have the necessary senses to understand other complex social relations that have emerged from being within coloniality. So then I will skip, I think I have like 3 minutes. Let me see, correct me if I'm wrong. So I wanna go towards the end because I go back to my classroom and I respond. I share with my students a chant that we had in the Joteria group at UC Berkeley. That would say, que viva la jotería, joto, y que, jotería, y que, y que, y que, y que. This y que, or so what, is in defiance of ideological common sense, an invitation to listen, a theory and a praxis into different worlds of sense, a referent to a dissonant corporeality that trespasses queer trans white theory, and y que, that confronts within the nonsense. Y que, the kinds of senses needed to understand the complexity of social life within gender coloniality, such as un transvesti así, a dissonant expression of corporeality from the geopolitics of the infrahuman in the Andean mountains, Di Pietro 2019. These beings and becomings provide us with complex approaches to understand multiple worlds of sense as to question how we know and how we think, perceive, and make sense of the flights of power that erase a long history of dissonant and permeable corporeality. Joteria is not an ethnic sexuality or effeminate gender expression, but as a way of living in the borderlands, the Southwest US, grounded in the US-Mexico borderlands, yet diasporic and moving, shifting, expanding, migrating through a constant shift in consciousness of living within gender coloniality, US imperialism, and a never-ending displacement, where yes, some Jotos are both queer, trans, and non-binary, yet neither gay or trans, and sometimes both, and sometimes in Soto's word, simplemente hombres con chichis, a community of trans-Latinidad if you insist. So we can now study Joteria scholarship. Joteria scholarship embraces Alexander's notion to a call to remember this bridge as the method of suturing, healing, and reclaiming the quote, the colonial body that has been dismembered by a history of ideological violence, end of quote. This method, according to James Garcia and Martinez, pieces together names, sutures, and repopulates the knowledge and forms of Joteria criticism that has been denied and appropriated in white queer theory. In this manner, Joteria scholarship not only sutures the ideological dismembering that constructs Joto as simply an ethnic gay identity. It begins to understand Joteria as complex ways of being within coloniality and as a social diasporic relationality, a history and meaning-making praxis, an embodiment of being both and within the complexities of Jotex, of being and or, but also not gay, but like femme, trans, marica, bucha, indio, mestizo, sin o con papeles, tortillera, puta, callejera, fronterizo, diasporic, or in exile. A Joto that means more than gay ethnic identities. In my course of Trans-Latinidad, this non-binary epistemic refusal opened the space to return to us, Joterias, in the archives, and to find the nonsense of the Latinx gay/lesbian as a non-binary thinking and being within coloniality. And I'm gonna stop there, but this is, because I think I'm out of time, but this is how I'm thinking about this paper. It's not fully done, so any questions, feedback, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So folks can be thinking about questions that you have. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat or to raise your hand. I think because I would think after like 3 years of being on Zoom, I would know how it all works, right? So I think what I was seeing to the side was people clapping as opposed to raising their hands. So, but if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand if you want to voice your question directly or to put it into the chat. While folks are thinking, one thing that I wanted to ask both Carolina and Omi is one thing that seemed to tie your papers together, but approaching it from very different directions, is the question of visibility, right? So Carolina, you were talking about the importance of having, particularly in the novels that you were thinking about, queer characters, but then also the sort of horizon of specifically trans characters, right? And you were noting the importance of having happy endings, right? To having modes of representation, which, as you put it, serve as a vital source of support and empowerment. So being able to see, right, characters who one might understand as queer or trans, Chicanx or Latinx, right, characters as itself, right, important in that, and the publication, as you noted, of a number of different young adult books like this year, right, as a kind of explosion in representation. We might think about that as a desire for visibility, as the power of visibility, as the possibilities of visibility. Whereas it seemed to me, Omi, that you're talking about the ways that a desire for visibility, right, the student wanting, right, trans Latinx scholars, right, persons who could be understood as belonging to those categories, that desire as coming from a certain idea of trans personhood, of trans subjectivity, which largely attaches to dominant notions of gender, dominant notions of transition, right, as well, from one gender to another, dominant notions of gender, which are largely historically and even currently pegged to whiteness, right? And you were talking, it seemed to me you were talking about moving beyond that desire for a kind of visible Latinx trans subject as such, to thinking trans-Latinidad as a set of conceptual, historical possibilities for understanding embodiment in relation to racialization and movement and networks to other people, which is not about coalescing a visible trans subject. So I was wondering if both of you might speak to a little bit sort of what you think in terms of visibility as a kind of goal, as a kind of project, if you had any reflections on each other's framings of visibility, but if you could sort of come back to this question of visibility to address that sort of more explicitly.
Yes, I mean, I can go first about the whole issue of visibility. I think a lot of us grew up reading and seeing ourselves represented in all of these very tragic ways. I mean, like queer characters in books and media. Students often talk about the bury your gays trope, and how there's even this like lists online of all the characters that have died tragically, queer characters in movies, books, etc. So yeah, when I talk about visibility is and having those positive endings and happy endings, and that's something that I've read a lot about Aristotle and Dante, that it has a very utopic ending. If folks in the chat have read it, it's kind of like this perfect ending of family coming together, and like a little bit unrealistic, but I see a lot of the need for that. And so, as you talked about the explosion of YA books, and with different, with non-binary characters, and that represent what Chicanx, Latinx, queer youth experience, right? I think it's really important. And also, that it's, it used to be these very small publishing houses that were publishing these books, like Arte Público Press, Unlut, but now it's becoming more mainstream, and it has its pros and cons, but I think it's important that it reaches community, and yeah, that's how I approach it in what I read, which is based on an article about the importance, especially now with everything that is happening within, the Don't Say Gay, Florida, Texas, everywhere pretty much. And so reading has become a resistance, like an act of resistance, and books are tools of resistance, and of literature, like I mentioned, in the Chicano aspect, but also in general, are tools of knowledge, of representation, and so that's pretty much how, like what I can say about that.
For me, in my work, I think there's aspects of visibility, right? Like on one hand, the visibility that is needed for like the everyday seeing yourself, right, in literature, seeing yourself in a positive way, like that's important too. And to me, it's more about what visibility does to then theory and thinking, because visibility is also, right, just what I think most of us know at this point, with the transgender tipping point in 2014, right, the visibility of trans issues and trans rights created like a wave of violence against trans people of color, right? And now we see like over 300 bills being presented against like trans childhood care and adults and all kinds of, like, that's the visibility of like the everyday visibility. And then there's the theoretical visibility that makes invisible colonial differences, which to me is another aspect of visibility. Like, what is, thinking with like perhaps Gloria Saldúa, like what is beyond the mirror, behind the mirror, invisibility, what becomes visible. There's always things around a mirror or behind the mirror, or even within the mirror, right? Like there's a monster within that is not visible unless you go and look at the mirror, right? Or there's other things that perhaps hold a particular mirror in place, right? In terms of like thinking about that type of visibility and seeing yourself. So definitely, I think politically, like every day, obviously it's important, but there's also the importance of what is behind this project of what we see and known, and the common sense of disability, right? Like what are we seeing, particularly now with trans childhoods. I definitely respect every parent's decision with their kids and so on, but then there's the invisible aspect of certain narratives, right, that can be taken apart and be like, well, if we have um, um, a migrant that is muche and we take them to psychology today, they're like, oh, you're trans, like they're not going to be, you know, culturally competent to discuss muche identity or two-spirit identity, right? Like there's that aspect of, oh, I don't know if the common sense of medicine and psychology today is there for all children, right? Like the common sense right now, it's a very understanding of bodies and transition that is very narrow. It is necessary, yes, but it's limited. So that doesn't take away from needing it and having access to it, right? There's also like that aspect of like, oh, are you culturally competent to address all trans embodiments and feelings of, you know, of gender dysphoria? And I'm writing about this and it's coming soon, but I talk about it in the sense of it's colonial dysphoria, this term that emerged in my dissertation of trans Latinx, especially indigenous folks that are current migrants, and they're from indigenous communities across Mexico and Central America. For them, it's like, it's more of like, I was fine with my, you know, gender expansiveness in other places. I have to construct it as a violent space, right? Like Honduras or El Salvador as hyper violent against trans folks. But in my community of, you know, with the elders, like I had a social role and a position and it was fine. Like coming here, it's like, oh my gosh, like you're this, and so it's that clash of what we think and know of trans as identity, as a social category of being and existing and whatnot. So I think that is like the tension we have with, right, knowledge production informs all other fields of like medicine and psychology, that, you know, if in theory we are making invisible certain aspects of cultural competency, then what's happening in the medical sector and in the psychology sector too. So that, I think that is important.
Does anyone have any questions for our wonderful speakers? While we're waiting for folks to get their thoughts together, Carolina, Omi, do you have any questions for each other?
Sorry, I was muted. I guess, yeah, I think my question would be, what are some ways in the literature specifically that non-binary and trans identity, right? Like now thinking with, well, it's not going to say trans, it's not going to say non-binary, but like in Ansaldúa, we see a lot of trans and non-binary ways of embodiment, right? So what are some themes that perhaps now come up when we look back at, you know, extremely famous, like, you know, the House of Mango Street and others, like, you know, literature that is, you know, well known, and, you know, revisiting those and kind of like bringing up points about like trans embodiment and trans being or non-binary thinking. Perhaps maybe you can talk about like if you see those themes as being there or not being there, or and talk
Right.
about differently.
That's very interesting because it's like going back and reading with a queer lens, things that, you know, like canonic texts that we impose this binary roles or heterosexual characters, right? That when we go back and read them with this queer lens, and then we think, you know, like non-binary characters. I think that there's a lot of work to be done on that. Like, you know, in my literature classes, like when students read, it's interesting when they read The House of Mango Street for the first time, they get this the friendship, the queerness in this friendship right away. But I remember reading it, you know, like 15 years ago, and thinking, oh, these are straight characters. I think students, you know, every time because they have this lens of, you know, more openness, or I mean, you know, their own queerness, they see things that maybe we were trained as, you know, literatos not to see those things, but focus on the form and canonic text. And so that is I think the job of all of us that do literature and gender studies, to deconstruct and go back and read this text with this non-binary, with this, you know, very queer lens. So I think that I see that with the students, and then coming up, like I was saying, all of these books that are coming out with, non-binary, and like you were saying, there's then when we think about books of Two Spirits, and it's interesting because um we also want to be careful of like impositions when we read like these books, and how they, yeah, because I was talking about how these canonic books are imposing this very, very male heteronormativity, but also we have to be careful on how these other books are framing being queer, being gay, and not to do the same thing of, oh, this is the new Chicanx identity. But I am very hopeful, and I mean, I wish I would have grown up seeing these books, reading these books, and feel like, like I belong in literature. And that's why, I talk about visibility, of how important it is, especially for groups that have been marginalized within marginalized groups, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's, yeah.
One thing that I'm wondering, sort of Carolina, as you were just noting, sort of the marginalized within the marginalized. Omi, coming back to something that you were saying before, you were noting that your own work, you're thinking a lot about indigenous people, right, who are coming as migrants from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Honduras, right? And you were also talking in your both your presentation and in your response to the questions about the problems of seeking recognition, right? So if there's, as Carolina was noting, if there's an emotional component to that, an important affective component to that, I am seen, I exist, right? And there's also a political dimension to being, right, seen in that way. But also, as you were noting, then in order to be recognized, one needs to fit the categories of the person from whom, or entity or institution from whom you're seeking recognition. And Omi, you were noting that in terms of thinking about the proliferation of kinds of desires, relationships, genders, the ways that those might not fit something like the frame, like an Anglo frame or the frame of the US state. But then I'm also wondering specifically, then thinking about indigenous people, right, who are migrating from, Central America, Latin America. What does it mean then conceptually to incorporate them into something like translatinidad, right? To understand them within, to what degree is that I hesitate to call it a mode of assimilation for all the reasons that we might imagine, but that kind of incorporation in a way that sort of parallels the very kind of incorporation or modes of sort of imposition that you're critiquing. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the tension between indigenous peoplehood and indigenous genders and indigenous modes of selfhood, right? And the variety among those, right? The tension between that and a concept like Latinidad.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing with both recent migrants and, people that have been in exile in the US, or they've been living in the US for, 15, 20 years. It's both things, right? That it's like coming to the US it's a first for both. It's like you become Latinx and become trans, right? Like prior to that coming here, there was no such thing as being in the Latinx community. So I think those two things, and I think in naming it Trans Latinidad, it's kind of because of the constraints of the academy and also our meaning making processes, right? That it's like we have to call it something, and I think instead of just like I didn't want to say it was trans Latinx people, and I used Latinidad to frame it as a cultural praxis that it spans beyond like nation states, right? That it's like there is some commonalities in praxis, right, between Mexican Americans or Mexican migrants and Central American migrants. Like there is something that does happen, and the commonality is the factor of like learning to be. And that learning to be is both learning to be Latinx and learning to be trans in this particular context. And that's what's interesting in even like migrant education programs, right? That it's like, oh, even like the the pronouns and all these other things that you have to start using, and like, oh, here is like you're a trans woman or a trans man or you're trans non-binary, and it's all these pedagogies of like, this is what transness is. And people are still like debating of like, oh, am I choosing trans woman or am I choosing trans non-binary? Like, what are the differences? Like, how do I choose? Right. And then here we are like talking to, people that have expressed, modes of being in their bodies that we ascribe them as like feminine or masculine or either or, and then we're like trying to create like a subjective personhood for them, for migration purposes, for immigration purposes, for educational for many reasons. And I think that's the aspect where the possibility of it's not just an identity as a this is who I am, but it's a praxis of this is who I need to show you who I am for a particular thing, right? So I think in the recognition of that of that learning to be and becoming for political purposes, that's where the possibility of like coalitional like practices emerge, right? That it's like, oh, I'm as an example, right? Like I needed this for medical reasons, so I'm gonna tell the doctor that I'm like, oh yeah, I lied, I had I've been thinking that I'm this person since childhood. I'm like, no, I have not, but I know that that's the rhetoric they wanted from me. So as a political, play of power, right, in the dynamic of like knowledge power, and I say this for personal reasons, and then my personal reasons for now having GID or genital dysphoria, now I can provide others with, I can help you, like, this is what you need and want, like this is how you frame it, but also like it can help you secure housing and all these other like tangible things beyond healthcare that are really necessary for a lot of trans people of color. So I think, again, being in the US, like, yes, becoming legible as both trans and Latinx is one thing, but then the practice is totally different, right? Like we're more in, like, one of the things that it's so important for trans Latinidad, it's the beginning with land. So one of the questions was not who am I, which is, it tends to be the traditional question for like trans understanding of being and becoming, right? Like, who am I? And it's like, oh, where am I? So now the question is like, where am I? And based on that, right, now that I'm in the US, I need to be this. So it's land is so important, and also recognizing now that we're, settlers or guests in other people's lands, then we're like, oh, what can I learn from, this histories and land here that informs my gender? So I think shifting that the shifting that I saw in the people that I work with is that it's like, oh, where am I is the first question rather than who am I? And the land where we're at pretty much informs the gender practices and the gender identity practices that people then take up. So, and then recentering land as thinking of transitions, not just as a personal thing we do, but transitions with the land itself and moving within that process. So yeah, it's.
And then also to note that to the extent that trans Latinidad is marking both the pressure of fitting into those categories within the US, right? But then it also seems that trans Latinidad is marking, for you at least to some extent, a mode of conceptualizing, a mode of noticing, a way of seeing, right? That is not beholden kind of to those categories that one needs to manifest for the purposes of recognition. And so, as you were noting before, you're talking about you look in the mirror, but what's beyond the mirror, what sets up the mirror, what makes the mirror possible, what gets erased by the mirror, right? And also wondering about the extent to which then the trans Latinidad as a concept, right, then invisibilizes indigeneity, right? And the significance of that, and the ways that then the to be in coalition can in fact necessitate or at least lead to, right, the invisibilization, right, of indigenes. So it's absorbed into Latinx population or Hispanic, right, quote unquote, on the census, right, in ways that then don't count, right, as indigenous, which of course is then a huge issue in thinking about relationships among indigenous people and peoples, right, the relationship between indigenous people and peoples whose territories are claimed by the US versus indigenous people and peoples, right, whose territories are claimed by Mexico or Guatemala or, right, Honduras, and how to have sort of, as Chad Allen put, trans-indigenous relations. So it's also thinking about what's the relationship between the sort of coalitional imagination of trans-Latinidad and the coalitional imagination of something like trans-indigenous, right? And so it's a thing to consider. But I think we have we have two. Two questions.
Sorry.
What?
Oh no, I just wanted to ask Omi. They were talking about. I was wondering because of I'm curious about the language aspect. If like for example, there's indigenous people that come to from Mexico, what is now Mexico, and that learn Spanish in the US. So it's like learning, and so it's like a double imposition of who you are in Spanish and then in English. Have you encountered that in the work that you do?
Yes, definitely. And that's the thing, right? Like that's the pedagogical aspect of like one is teaching, right? The colonial languages, and then the colonial understanding of embodiment and identity and gender. So yeah, it's a double position. And to go back, one of my colleagues at UC Berkeley, Dr. Alan Peláez Lopez, writes about the X as a wound, right, in Latinx. And the fourth wound is inarticulation. And I think part of the call to cancel Latinidad is that inarticulation of like indigeneity at the core of a lot of the erasures, right? That the indigenous violence and colonization as the core of the wounds, right? And the fourth wound as the inarticulation being that now we claim to, now we articulate who we are, despite the possible erasures. It doesn't mean that people that ascribe to trans Latinidad don't ascribe to trans indigeneity. Like they can exist simultaneously. It's just more to become more legible to other forms of embodiment that are just not trans, right? That it's like maybe joteria or joto or effeminate or like other or bucha that are not precisely, they're like the unclear categories that are like, is it queer? Is it sexuality? Is it gender? What is it? It's all of it, right? Or none of it. Or so I think that opens up the space of both a trans Latinidad to like, okay, this is a particular form of articulating ourselves as a group, but it doesn't mean that there's no other forms of articulation of like, a trans indigeneity, right? Or just indigeneity specific to certain pueblos or groups. So definitely, yeah, it's basically a political choice to like call it trans Latinidad to make sense and make visible certain aspects of gender embodiment and expansiveness in response to what we understand of the materiality of bodies and transgender bodies. But then again, yes, it invisibilized other things as indigeneity and like it and also histories, right? The part of the articulation of a trans embodiment is to, a lot of what happens is a lot of histories of different communities merge in the US, and now you have this like pan Indian indigenous like understanding of two-spiritness in Latin America that is definitely two-spiritness, that it's different from what we know of two-spirit in the US, right? Which is a term very particular to the US indigenous two-spirit populations. So now they confront, like, oh, am I two-spirit? Can I take two-spiritness because I'm indigenous? But over here, so now it's like, are folks gonna come up with a new term? Maybe, I don't know, but like it makes sense for them. It's like, oh, it's similar, but it again, like some folks might say, yeah, I'm two-spirit, and it's like we can't just be like, oh no, that's not for you. Like like how do I correct someone that it's a new arrival, that a migrant, that it's from an indigenous communities, right? And so there's also that, right, that tension of like, well, people will start making choices for themselves and articulating themselves as particular people that make sense to them. So that's definitely like one of the tensions too.
So we have two questions, so I'll read these out, and then I think the responses to these questions will be the close. So we have from Xavier Amaro, sort of a question for both presenters, but when talking about archival erasure and the practice of looking for within the archive, how does Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation fit in? Critical fabulation is, quote, the combining of historical and archival research with critical theory and fictional narrative to fill in the blanks left in the historical record. How do we combine historical theory with fiction while also circumventing the looking for or limiting our imagination beyond coloniality? And then Pooja Shah says, thank you, Dr. Alonso and Dr. Salas-SantaCruz for your engaging presentations. I have a question for Dr. Salas-SantaCruz. How do you distinguish the idea of looking for something as different from representation in your classroom to discuss how colonial complexity is embedded within trans knowledge production?
Okay. Okay. So the first one, I think for, let's see, how do we combine history? Okay. Yeah, and I think what we need, it's not the, I don't think it's the that we have to combine. I think sometimes people have not given access to certain ways of writing ourselves in history, right? So there is definitely like, there's different levels of access, right? There's levels of access to literary production, there's access to like oral histories, or, you know, all kinds of things that people leave behind. And I think one of the ways that quote unquote who we're understanding as like trans Latinx subjects in contemporary, like, you know, and I'm only thinking I think this example was someone, it was like 1950s, right? That they were, even in the archive, they're what we can call misgendered, and they were name or that name, even though there's an interview where this trans woman says, oh, I'm a woman though. They just see me as this like gay man, and my name is, right, like a female name. And then the author starts writing about like this gay Joto history, right? So it's like, ooh, when I read that, it's oral history from a trans person, right? That it's like naming herself, yet at that time is just understood as like a gay Latinidad, right? So to me, it's like that kind of, oh, you know, it's kind of like this tension of like, we've been writing about this, and what, you know, we've been thinking through like gender expansiveness, and there's trans folks that had given us their life stories, their concerns or political concerns, or like all kinds of things. And it's just reading back to understand what people are saying. There's definitely in the School of Education, there's books where they're considered like the LGBT studies in education, and you know, they talk about queerness and queerness and queerness, and I'm like, this person just said they're trans like 10 different ways, and we're just saying, we're calling it like female masculinity, and it's like, okay, well, you know, at those terms at the time, and this person's telling you a very clear way that they're like what we now know as non-binary trans, and it's like, there's ways to understand like what would it mean to now look at those texts and think about, these people were not really just talking about sexual practices, they were talking about their gender identity and their gender embodiment, and they were just read as queers, you know, queer sexualities. So I think there's ways of looking at the archive, and I'm assuming, and this is maybe Carolina can answer this, like there are you know, fictional narratives that perhaps also are talking about non-binary and transness and trans embodiments from a different lens. We just haven't really considered them as trans novels in this way.
Yeah, I know we don't have time, but I just wanted to mention historian Emma Perez and how she has done a lot of, you know, in a conference, I remember her saying, I couldn't find in the archives stories that I know exist because, you know, of references of, you know, like trans characters or non-binary or people, or queer people fighting in the wars like the Alamo. So she wrote Forgetting the Alamo with this character that goes into war as a man. And so looking and like what she calls filling the interstitials, right? And writing ourselves into the history that wasn't, I mean, was not permitted or has been, you know, it's hidden somewhere or gone, right? So yeah, Emma Perez would be one of the examples, and Forgetting the Alamo.
I mean, so then on this point, it's both, Omi, as you were saying, that there is evidence in the archives if one actually looks, but then also, Carolina, as you were suggesting, then if critical fabulation with Hartman is a scholarly methodology, part of, Carolina, what you're talking about is Chicanx and Latinx writers using the writing of fiction as a way of trying to offer stories that they have not seen chronicled, that they have not seen recorded, so that it functions as a kind of history, even as one also, again, as Omi is suggesting, might read the archives, right, differently too, that both projects, both intellectual projects, right, are available. We're at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much to our speakers, right, for your wonderful presentations and question and answer. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.